Hi, BookTube, and welcome to another fiction review. There is a theatricality to the novel we look at today, and in fact there's a particular theatrical venue, the National Theatre in London, and so that's the photographic theme of this video. In terms of the book itself, there is a theatrical event which we are led to anticipate right from the opening chapter, as well as, of course, the party that's going to follow. But the text itself actually presents like a play in 4 acts, with each act having 3 scenes, and each scene feels a little like a documentary or a storytelling, a prose poem biopic of one of the party guests. You might imagine a spotlight falling as each scene begins, a beam that isolates that one person from the others for a while. Although it must be stressed that between all 12 people there are connections, all sorts of connections: blood, marriage, friendship, enmity, business, identity. You, the reader, are uniquely privileged because the amount of knowledge you are given about each person is more than any of their fictional connections has. You see beyond first impressions, beyond judgments and biases. You witness whole lives lived, whole people, instead of that insufficient amount of knowing that we often have about our own personal connections. And by the time I finished all those biographies and was allowed to mingle with all the party guests, it really did feel that I had emerged from a dark theatre after a tour de force performance. Today, we are reviewing Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, published in 2019 by Penguin Books. Let's go straight to the first question. Can I pitch this novel? My paperback copy has French flaps, and in addition to showing off bright, saturated colors that you can see on the cover, they also are filled with quotes from various reviewers. The Times and the New York Times reviewers, now either they read each other's work or they discussed their columns pre-publication, or maybe they just happen to think of the same word at the same time to describe girl, woman, other. Polyphonic. Now, conversely, the cover art gave me the impression that this novel would focus on a single character. The first character we meet, Amma, she is important, but she is more like a point of reference than a protagonist. Evaristo's narrator acts like an omniscient hostess at a party, and she leads the reader from that point of reference to meet many other characters closely and remotely connected with Amma. Most of these characters are also attending a play that is written by Amma. We don't get any first-hand description of the performance. We get instead stories of 12 women who will be in the audience on opening night, invited because they have some connection with the playwright. And this novel thematically looks at human connections. How are they formed? How are they broken? Which ones matter? And which ones endure in spite very poor odds? And making the point that sometimes the people physically closest are the most distant, and conversely, people who may be furthest away can hold the closest place in our hearts. Question 2, the all-important book details. How long is it? How did I get it? How much did I pay? Well, the paperback version of Girl, Woman, Other is 452 pages long. The font looks 11 point, I'm going to say, but you've got to bear in mind that Evaristo has not chosen to write in conventional paragraph prose. I'm going to talk more about that later, but suffice it for this section to bear in mind that you're going to get a slightly higher amount of white space in those pages. I bought my copy new at Waterstones in the summer of 2020, and the Black Lives Matter protests can take credit for my decision to start fixing a hole, because there's no other way to describe it, a hole in my literary knowledge. Evaristo's book was one of 5 that I purchased on the same day in order to kickstart a Black literature reading habit. I paid £8.99, and I think I may have got a discount of some kind, like cheapest book for free, because I bought so many on the same day. At the time of recording, Amazon is still selling the paperback in the UK for £8.79, in the US for $9.50, and the Kindle version in the UK £4.99, or in the US $8.67. Question 3, of course, is always some details about the author. Bernardine Evaristo was born and grew up in southeast London. She was the fourth of 8 children in a mixed-race household. Her mother was English, Irish, German ancestry, and her father came to Britain from Nigeria in 1949, and he became the first black councillor of the borough of Greenwich. In an interview for the BBC, Evaristo says that as the fourth of 8 children, you can imagine this, she rarely got to watch what she wanted on the telly. Her brothers always wanted to watch the football, and so she would frequently go to the library for books. She says, from the age of 5, every week I was getting out as many books as I could. When she was 12, she joined the Greenwich Young People's Theatre, and she says it was the making of my childhood. She decided after finishing school to attend the Rose Bruford College of Speech and Drama, and she graduated in 1982. Faced with little prospect of finding work as an actor of color in the 1980s, Evaristo, along with Paulette Randall and Patricia Hilaire, founded Theatre of Black Women, the first organization of its kind in Britain. Bernardine also organized the first Black Writers' Conference and the first Black Theatre Conference during the 1990s. Her life story actually does have an incredible number of firsts. She was also the first Black woman to win the Booker Prize for Girl, Woman, Other in 2019, and she was the first Black president of the Royal Society of Literature. She remains politically active. If you visit her website, bevaristo.com, I just like the sound of that, there's a page devoted to the advocacy work that she has done to champion Black creativity. Evaristo is currently Professor of Creative Writing at Brunel University in London. This is the bit where we talk about setting, but in the case of Girl, Woman, Other, we have to say settings, plural, because the characters are 20th century people. So they relocate. They have mixed heritage in a lot of cases, so there are migration stories, and there is one repatriation. They grow up, so they leave home. They have families, so they need more space. They divorce and get older, so they need less space. There are a lot of well-drawn work settings in this book: schools, farm, theatre, commune. The setting is dynamic. The setting is change, and whatever the characters need. Regarding viewpoint, the narrator introduces each new character story in the third person, but the narrative voice, the voice is unique, well, at least to me, unique to my reading experience. Let's talk about a few of these differences. Evaristo uses all forms of punctuation except full stops, or if you're North American, periods. Each sentence is given its own white space, as if it were a paragraph. And sentences are mostly grammatically correct, but some of them do slip into the syntax of a character's speech or thoughts and be fragmentary. Frequently, the text also, it just abandons prose formation altogether, and the visual effect is kind of like poetry. They aren't poems, but when I read them, I imagine a narrator reciting, perhaps performing as a storyteller. This visual dynamism that's in the text, when you consider how it matches the dynamism of all those changing settings, it makes the reading happen more quickly. That's going to sound strange, but that's how I perceived it. The 452 pages seem to take less effort to read than they normally would. And these are all aspects that the reader's going to miss if they choose to listen to Girl, Woman, Other as an audiobook. This is where I normally read a passage out of the book, but instead of just doing that, I've photographed the pages that I'm going to read out, and so that you can see this effect on screen as I read. You are not our daughter in the biological sense, her father told her at lunch on her 16th birthday. Great timing. She'd been left in a cot on the steps of a church. They'd waited until she was old enough to understand. She'd been mysteriously deposited without certification, no note, no clues, nothing. They'd tried for their own child for years, failed, found her in an orphanage. It was quite easy to adopt back then. They signed papers, took her home. What they didn't add in that moment was that they loved her, something they'd never told her. What she needed in that moment was a declaration of unconditional love from the people who'd raised her as their own. Instead, they carried on as normal, even though tears were streaming down her face. They remained seated on the high-backed chairs in their allotted places around the oval dining table, covered with a fringed tablecloth. They unraveled the napkins, rolled up in wooden rings with their names etched into them. They ate the lamb chops, minted potatoes, and buttered peas they had for Sunday lunch, passing the gravy, passing the pepper, passing the salt. Penelope, unable to dislodge a potato stuck in her throat, left the table without permission, ran choking upstairs to her bedroom, where she collapsed in a sobbing heap on her bed, desperately hoping that at least her mother might check up on her. She listened for the pad of slippered feet on the stairs, a tentative knock, the door opening, a pat on her back. A cuddle was too much to hope for. Instead, she heard the man she'd thought her father until a short while ago leave the house to play golf with his brother, no longer her uncle, as he did every Saturday afternoon. The woman who used to be her mother would be sitting in front of the fire, crocheting white booties for her youngest niece, Linda, no longer Penelope's baby cousin. Penelope could hear comedy and laughter playing on the radio downstairs. To them, it was a normal Saturday afternoon. Does this novel fit a genre label? I was going to say that Girl, Woman, Other was 100% character-driven, but I changed my mind. It's certainly 0% plot-driven, okay? Be prepared for that. The 12 stories, they're not pieces which create a larger unified narrative structure as we think of in plot-driven books. There's no dramatic scheme that's going to build tension to one single high point. There are climactic moments all over the book, the kind you find in real life, the kind, like the passage I just read aloud, that dropped on Penelope out of nowhere. I was going to say 100% character-driven, but I believe the novel is also driven to some degree by an overriding theme. The individual stories demonstrate just how much we need our human connections, and yet how often we fail to take an action that would strengthen the good connections, or an action that would stop a bad connection from doing more harm than it has already done. Is there anything else which stands out about this book? Yeah. In addition to the visualness of the language that you've already seen from the passage I read aloud, there is another visual communication form in the symbols which appear at the start of each new character story, like the one that I've put in the photograph here. These are Adinkra symbols. They originated with the Bono people in West Africa in what is now Ghana. And they can be interpreted, and there are a number of websites that elaborate on the meanings. I understand that there are about 200 in total. The most I could find online, the longest list, had about 98. So I'll leave a link to that in my description box. It was enjoyable to look up the symbols and to think about, for example, Bumi's symbol, which looks like a turtle, and it means adaptability, and to consider how that symbol fits with the character's story. So I wondered whether the symbol might have been used, whether Evaristo perhaps used these symbols as a starting point for developing her characters, but I couldn't find anything online which either confirmed or denied that. Is there problematic content in this book? Since the narrator has us looking back on the character's past years, I found that problematic content tended to be summarized or visited briefly. Nevertheless, there are experiences of sexual violence, there is emotional and physical abuse. There is one story which is more detailed, where the character experiences fertility problems, miscarriages, and postpartum depression. And there is lots of racially motivated neglect and unkindness, racial slurs, and denial of service. If we're talking about context, one thing that struck me was that so often in this novel, the painful experiences which happen to these women remain secret. They don't share their pain. Often they're quite justified, I think, in believing they can't share with certain people. Sometimes they are not. But for example, there was one woman who found herself the only Black person in a 1960s British village. And the hostility was a combination of sort of the obvious and the in-your-face with the covert and the sneaky. And you understand why that character doesn't choose to open up, even when she does encounter someone kind, because she feels she can't afford to make herself more vulnerable than she already is. And finally, any suggestions for related or follow-up reading. Bernardine Evaristo has an X account, you know, that new version of Twitter. In a post she wrote on the 18th of June, she responds to the news headline that author Arundhati Roy is going to be prosecuted by the new Indian government for remarks that Roy made 14 years ago in a speech in 2010, where she questioned the political status of Kashmir. I find this whole global leaning toward extreme right-wing politics disturbing. And I'm hoping that there's going to be enough opposition to the prosecution that prevents Roy from being convicted. After I read the tweet, I went to the library and I saw a book by Roy, and so I signed it out from the library. And it is called Sleeping on Jupiter, and it was longlisted for the 2015 Booker Prize. I'm also going to leave a link in my description box to the Guardian newspaper article about that prosecution. And that is another book review done. What can we look forward to? Well, what we can look forward to, I need to thank somebody for what we can look forward to. So please, everyone, if you have not visited this channel, I encourage you to do so. Paul Mars, thank you so much. I really enjoyed his videos where he came up with book selections, not the latest shiny thing on the shelves, but fantastic, unusual book selections for his summer reading book club. He came up with 12 titles in all, and one of those, oh my, was such a big blast from my past. It's a book I own, and it's a book that I love to reread, and you know how unusual rereading is for me. It is a book about creative writing, yeah, and that is why I bought it originally. But whether I'm writing or not, or even if I'm writing and the writing is going just fine, there's something about this book. It's always a boost. It's always a tonic. It's always a pathfinder. I'm going to tell you more about that in the next video. Until then, everybody, good luck with your reading plans for July. Yes, it's July. And my Read What You Own challenge is 2/3 finished. Hurrah! Oh, okay. That's enough excitement for an English person on a hot day, okay? I'll see you again soon, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.